I recently found myself doing more research on vampires and vampire folklore than I ever expected. And in the midst of that research, I kept having the same burning question in the back of my mind. Why are vampires and werewolves always linked in media? I don't think I've seen a modern movie or TV show about either monster without the other. And I kept asking myself, why? So I decided to dive into that question and get to the bottom of it. An incredibly fun fact about where the modern idea of werewolves and vampire enemy trope comes from is actually from movies. That's right, the connection between vampires and werewolves is only a few decades old, which is vastly different from the few hundred-year-old folklore about vampires and werewolves. So how did we go from two Gothic literature monsters to one of the most common dueling partners in modern monster media? To really understand why there's a vampire-werewolf feud, we have to really understand where vampires and werewolves come from on their own. Modern vampires, as we know them in 2022, aren't exactly the vampires of the 1800s. Most people in today's society see vampires as the current teen heartthrob. But to stay on the same page, we're going to picture vampires in their mid-1900s form: Transylvanian, black hair, fangs, high collar, pale, burns in sunlight, sleeps in a coffin. You get the picture. But these vampires still aren't the original idea of what vampires were. Many people in the early days of vampires compared them to demons and portrayed them as awful, life-taking monsters. So where did they originally hail from? People believe the origin of vampires began with Bram Stoker's novel Dracula, published in 1897. But the folklore of vampires goes back way before then. Tales of vampire stories go back as far as China, India, and ancient European countries, with stories of those who were dead and then had risen from the grave to feast on the blood of the living. Many factors play a role in the idea of where vampires come from. A main contributing factor is just the lack of understanding in the human body and medical knowledge. A large factor being many people were being buried alive in the 1800s. Even though being buried alive was more common occurrence in small, remote communities, the number was large enough that fables of enhanced truths about the dead rising became common folklore that traveled through to larger cities as well. In the 20th century, it's estimated that in the US alone, at least one case a week was reported of someone being buried alive. So what did that mean? Well, it meant people screaming from a buried coffin. It meant people heard movement in coffins that were being transported. And it meant in poorer towns and communities where coffins were not used and bodies were just buried, people began trying to dig their way out of the hole they had been placed in. That kind of scary reality made people's imaginations run wild and began to create monsters we know today. You may ask, why do people believe vampires drink blood? And that's an excellent question. Well, even in early days of man, they understood the significance of blood. In biblical times, blood was used as a sacrifice to God, as a form of worship. The Holy Bible states in Leviticus 10:14, "If any man whosoever in the house of Israel, and of the strangers that sojourn among them, eat blood, I will set my face against his soul, and I will cut him off from among his people, because the life of the flesh is in the blood." Because of their understanding of the importance of blood and what it meant for the body and the soul to stay alive, it makes sense that in order to preserve their immortal bodies, vampires would drain people of the liquid that preserved human life. From all the stories that were passed through generations, authors began to stretch these stories and give names and faces to the vampires that had been talked about so much. Many short stories about vampires began to be published, and each of those stories followed its own path, representing vampires as different types of creatures with different appearances and abilities. Early in vampire literature, the vampire portrays Lord Ruthven as a suave, wealthy vampire with super speed and strength, enjoying mind games and social torture. Carmilla, the story of a female vampire who preyed on women using her charm and beauty, drained women of their life force by biting them and sucking the life out of them slowly over time. In the midst of the growing Gothic literature genre, Bram Stoker published the story of the most famous vampire, Dracula. There have been countless spin-offs of Dracula's story alone, and the introduction of television and movies only bred life for more. The earliest version of a vampire on screen, Nosferatu, shows the story of a vampire and his most inhuman representation of a vampire we see on the screen. After that film, vampires were characterized as more human in their appearance. In the last few decades, there was another resurgence of vampire stories. Dracula 1992, Blade, the Underworld film series, which we're going to come back to later, the Twilight series, True Blood, Vampire Diaries, and the novels that came along with many of those series as well. No matter how distant from the 1800s time gets, the lore of vampires continues to resurge and make its mark on each generation. So let's jump into werewolves now. Werewolves are seen in many different portrayals, usually believed to be the dumber, hairier, equally strong counterpart to vampires. I like to picture werewolves in their true half-man, half-wolf form, walking upright, completely wolf-looking, meat-eating, changing under the light of the full moon. Now that we're all together, let's dive into the original belief of what werewolves were. Similarly to vampires, werewolves don't exactly have one place in the world that they come from. The oldest written acknowledgement of werewolves comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh, an epic poem that dates back to ancient Mesopotamia. Werewolves are also brought out in Greek mythology with the introduction of Lycaon, the son of Pelagus, who angered Zeus, and he turned Lycaon and his sons into wolves. In Nordic mythology, the saga of Volsungs tells the story of a father and son who wear wolf pelts and turn into wolves and go on killing rampages. Where do these kinds of tales come from? Well, similarly to vampires, the origin of werewolves comes from a lack of understanding of nature and the way things work in that time. Rabies, for example, is a disease that in the later stages in humans can cause delirium and hallucinations. Both humans and animals, commonly dogs with rabies, can become rabid. Dogs with rabies are more likely to bite humans, and then humans can experience spasmodic episodes of fever, drooling, and periodic paralysis. And what's the most common cause of rabies in humans? An animal bite. To anyone in modern times witnessing a person with rabies, it can be extremely scary and unsettling. Seeing rabies before there was an understanding of the disease, and only understanding that a dog bite led to a maniac and then that death, it's easy to understand the correlation of wolf to man in the order of events as they happen. Hypertrichosis, also known as werewolf syndrome, is a condition that causes excessive hair growth in places beyond common hair locations, with the exception of the palms and the soles of the feet. The inexperience of humanity with different types of diseases like this, that's what's believed to be the root of the half-wolf, half-man lore. Because of this, stories of werewolves blossomed everywhere in the world. People claimed to be a werewolf and would use that as an excuse for murder. Estonia, Netherlands, Latvia, and many more saw people coming forward claiming to turn into a wolf and hunt through forests. Some murderers even claimed to have ointments that turned them into werewolves, which is what made them killers. 3 famous men in the 1500s, Giles Gardner, Pierre Bergot, and Michael Verdun, were such men, and all were burned at the stake, and many more as well. While there's no definitive reason as to why werewolves and the full moon are linked, some say it's because wolves were known to howl at moons. Another theory came out more recently when it was found that of the 91 violent incidents that happened between August 2008 and July 2009, 23% of those events occurred on nights with a full moon, showing some correlation between full moons and human violence. While nothing definitive comes from that, it's interesting to associate the link from the 2000s to the 1700s and wonder if the link from violence to full moons was known or understood then. Werewolves have had fewer media representations than vampires. They have had far fewer stories written about them, and none that named a werewolf and focused the story around that character. In television and movies, An American Werewolf in London and The Howling brought the idea of the modern werewolf to the big screen, with the wolf transformation and an upright walking on 2 legs wolf that has a more common werewolf aesthetic. Since then, many more movies have been made portraying a blend between the two, man-wolf and wolf-man. And it's not until the Twilight Saga that we see werewolves represented as 100% wolf changed from 100% man. Now that we understand about werewolves and vampires, let's get back to my main question that we're asking here. Why are vampires and werewolves battle bros? Let's take a look at the anthropomorphic view of vampires and werewolves. In most classic representations of these monsters, both vampires and werewolves actually have many super monster abilities. Super speed, super eyesight, super strength, super hearing. Both are known to be almost invulnerable and have incredible healing abilities and only a handful of useful weapons that can be used against them. Some other similarities is their transitions are almost 100% the same. Bites and curses are how both turn from humans to monsters. In most tellings of each monster, they feed on human flesh and blood and leading to human death. Do you see the pattern here? They're very similar monsters, so obviously they have been known to cross into each other's tales over the centuries of their existence, right? Oddly enough, not really. The only crossover seen in written form in the last 50 years was Dracula himself, who was able to transform into a werewolf. So why do so many people in modern society see the vampire and the werewolf as enemies? The answer? The Underworld series. Crazy, right? Virtually no rivalry pops up between vampires and werewolves until the 2003 movie Underworld is released. In this series, the werewolves and vampires all come from the same line of one werewolf and one vampire, twin brothers named Marcus and William. Both were born with an immortality gene. William is bitten by a rabid wolf and becomes the first werewolf. Marcus is bitten by a bat and becomes the first vampire. The problem for William, though, is he cannot control his werewolf transformation or maintain his human thoughts. He's on a rampage of hunting and killing, and his brother Marcus's ultimate desire was to stop him safely. Marcus turned a local warlord, Victor, into a vampire with the promise from Victor that he would help save William and keep him safe. But Victor lied, and he took William as a prisoner and used his blood to build a werewolf army. Eventually, Victor began turning these werewolves into slaves. After a few hundred years, the first Lycan, Lucian, is born. A Lycan in this series is a human who transforms into a werewolf only under a full moon and transforms back into a man when that full moon is gone. Different from werewolves before, who had only transitioned once in their initial transformation and then never back into human again. Victor built an army of Lycans with the use of Lucian's blood. Lucian eventually escapes with the other Lycans and kills a vampire horde, taking their home. And this is where we see the beginning of the werewolf-vampire rivalry. In the series, the war rages on between the two groups, and the story is followed in 4 more films released over the series. But it only took one to give birth to the rivalry lore attached to the two monsters. Kinda boring? I thought so too. I couldn't believe that one of the ultimate rivalries of my youth didn't have a big historical legend wrapped into it. Since the release of the Underworld series, almost every major pop representation of vampires or werewolves has its counterpart as an enemy. But fear not, there are some psychological beliefs as to why the two were pitted against each other by storytellers. Both werewolves and vampires are at least half human and are capable of human thought. The human desire to come out on top means they believe themselves to be the stronger monster and develop a feud to demonstrate who is stronger. A societal influence on the feud between the two monsters is the woven belief in a two-party political system, where one is stronger than the other and more powerful than the other, thinking they have nothing in common. But the reality is, both are evil, which is pretty much a different side of the same coin. Well, there you have it. What seems to be one of the most obvious rivalries was actually not written until many centuries after the birth of both monsters. Luckily for modern TV and movie watchers, this has not stopped storytellers from providing many opportunities to witness this feud play out. Hopefully you learned as much as I did. Until next time.